Hello and welcome to the very first Swaay.Health podcast. This is a very special episode. You're going to hear from the three podcast hosts. That's Brittany Quemby, John Lynn, and myself. We're going to be talking about our plans for this podcast and what you can expect. All three of us are very excited to have you on board with us as we start this new and exciting journey together. It's going to be fun, exciting, educational, and did I mention fun? Well, on this first episode, we asked our good friend and veteran healthcare podcaster, Carol Flagg, to ask the questions and to be our host. Let's get to it.
Swaay.Health.
Well, hello, John, Colin, and Brittany. I'm so excited to be, a guest host of your very first episode of your podcast, which is debuting soon on the marketplace, the Swaay.Health podcast. And thanks for inviting me on to chat with you guys. You know, I love to talk about podcasts. I've had both John, Colin, you've been on my podcast. Brittany, we're gonna rectify that and make sure you're on my show at some point too. But thanks for inviting me on to chat with you guys. I can't wait to listen to the first episode and become a fan and a follower. So yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks, Carol, for agreeing to be our interviewer. Because, we couldn't basically, between John, myself, and Brittany, we couldn't decide. We couldn't even draw straws. We said, you know what, we need a neutral third party, and so couldn't think of anyone better than you to be our first interviewer.
Well, rock, paper, scissors is really hard with three people, so I get it. I get it. It's almost impossible. Well, then, okay, I've got some questions for you. Hopefully to educate the audience as to what the Swaay.Health podcast will be about. And of course, that first question is, what inspired you to start the podcast? And what is the general overall theme and content description of the podcast going to be about?
Yeah, I'll take a first shot at that. So first of all, we started the podcast because everyone else was starting one, and we thought, well, we don't want to be left out. No, I'm kidding. No, it's just what we heard from our readers and people who watch our videos, and they're saying, listen, those are great and they serve definitely love those, but would love to have a podcast because I listen to podcasts when I'm driving in or when I'm traveling, and it's hard to watch a video. And I don't have time to maybe read something when I'm traveling, running through the airport. So if you had a podcast version of some of the things that you do, that would be wonderful. That way I can just listen to it and not have to worry about the video. So, after hearing that enough times, we're like, you know what, we finally need to launch this. It was always in our plan, but we wanted to also just launch something to make sure that it was valuable. So now felt like the right time to do it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the value part of it. I like to say, the world maybe doesn't need another podcast, but the world definitely still needs valuable content. So I think that's really what the message is there. And I know you guys, everything that you do is of value to the Swaay.Health community and the marketing community at whole. All right. So topics, tone, is this going to be the three of you hosting together? You're going to take turns hosting. Can we expect, knowing the three of you, I think a little levity, I suppose, in the content itself? Not that you're not serious folks, but I know you well enough to know that a good laugh is always right around the corner.
It's funny you say that, Carol, because I'd go back to what you said is at the end of the day, we want to provide value. We want to provide value to the healthcare marketing community, whether you're a provider organization or whether you're at a health IT company. Our question at Swaay.Health, and this has always been the premise for all of healthcare scene, the overarching company, is how can we be valuable to the people who read us, to the people who listen to us, to the people that watch the videos that we create. And so at the end of the day, that is the overarching goal, is how can we be valuable? And when you look at value, a lot of people are like, okay, well, what's value even mean when it comes to content? And, to your point, I think people underestimate that humor can be very valuable. Sometimes we need a little levity in our lives, and we're stressed in our jobs. Healthcare marketing is a stressful job where everyone thinks they know how to do their marketing position. And so they always want to chime in with their 2 cents on how marketing should be done. And you often do bridge the gap between sales and product in a lot of areas. And so as a marketing person, it's great if we can provide some levity. So certainly we'll do some of that. But yeah, I'd say at the end of the day, the goal is how can we provide value? Sometimes that's education. And how can we educate them on maybe a hot topic or a regulatory issue or a new technology that's coming out? I think education's a great perspective. Another one that is popular for us is just bringing on experts in the field that can share their expertise. And so I think that's another one that's very useful. A third one that I'd throw out there, I guess a fourth if you count levity, humor is one. The other one that's I think really interesting is how can you educate them on trends in the market? And in the health IT side, that might be trends associated with new health IT conferences or even old health IT conferences that no one's heard about. How do you educate them on how those conferences have evolved? Last night I was talking to a healthcare marketing person and they were like, "What do you think about this conference?" And I was like, "Well, it used to be this, but now it's more this." And they're like, "Oh,
Right.
wow, I didn't realize that. I just see it online and I had, should I go or should I not?" And it helped them kind of understand should they go or not. And so, I mean, I think that's the example of kind of being practical and sharing valuable information that will help them do their job better. That was one of the principles Colin taught me early on when we started working together. He's like, if we can make them look good, then we're doing a good job. And, I think that's
Yeah.
kind of underpinning of what we like to do too. If we provide valuable information or resources to these marketing professionals so they look good to their boss, then that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that I talk about many times with clients that we work on in development of their podcast, kind of getting back to the value and the levity, but also the production value. I mean, I think that, you all agree, as do I, that listening to a podcast, it is a form of entertainment. It is an engagement issue, and people are, listening on their AirPods or driving to work or whatnot. And so if you can make it interesting, and funny goes a long way in making it interesting, that's to me what grabs and holds the attention. People will tune in to hear what you three as hosts have to say. Not that the guests aren't important and the topics, and maybe some will have guests and maybe some won't, but just even your own experience on your radio show, Healthcare IT Today. People are tuning in because you two are engaging, you're very funny, you're a great foil for each other, and that's really what makes it interesting, valuable content delivered in a non-boring way, I think.
We're going to strive to bring the same vibe and flair that I think everyone expects from us. A lot of people see us at conferences or they see us at our annual conference. So one of the big goals is to ensure that we bring the vibe and flair that they come to expect from the three of us to the podcast and to their ears.
Yeah. So I think everybody who is tuning in to this episode and knows who Swaay.Health is and knows who you are, understands that the overall intended audience is for marketers. What kind of marketers? What roles? What is the actual target audience within this big framework of the term marketing, healthcare marketing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Carol. And it is such a broad industry, right? Like healthcare marketing spans so many different parts of healthcare. So I think the main audience, there are a few, but the big pillars would be, of course, the healthcare IT marketers. So these are marketers who work at healthcare vendors. So whether those are IT vendors, service vendors, anybody who basically is trying to sell something to to the healthcare system, we will have content and material that is going to be appealing and useful for them. Also, we're going to have a lot of great content on the podcast for marketers who work at provider organizations, right? So these are the people working to attract patients, to attract clinicians, and so we're going to have a lot of content for them as well. And that's been a growing area of the Swaay.Health community. We've had a lot more provider marketers tune in and watch our stuff and read our materials. So we're covering a lot more of those things, and those topics would be, how to fight retail health, right? How to stand up against an Amazon, right? Or I'd also cover things like more patient experience and how digital front door is making changes and how that's evolving. So topics like that. And then we also have marketers that are at a lot of nonprofits. right? So these are associations, these are and but the industry associations, like the ones that we all go to, like the Hims of the world, the Healths of the world, Chimes,
Times.
but also some of the specialty and clinical associations. We know we have some listeners and readers of our stuff there, so we'll have some content for them as well. So those are sort of the three big pillars, and then anybody who's involved in the marketing function in healthcare. I won't say we're excluding payers or excluding pharma, but we'll definitely have some content that might be appealing to them. I mean, SEO, for example, would appeal to anybody.
Yeah.
But those three are the three primary audiences that for now we're focused on with this podcast.
And what's cool about having all those audiences together in one platform is that it really goes back to when I started the Swaay.Health community over a decade ago. When I started it, I was like, I want to have a few people who will come and say something that will really piss off the B2B marketer and be like, no, you don't understand what healthcare B2B marketing is like. Like, I wanted to have some of that because I wanted them to stretch their minds and be able to say, okay, yeah, you're right. I can't do what that consumer marketer did, but could I tweak it a little? Could I open my mind a little bit to what is the consumer doing in marketing and how could I apply that to the B2B space, or vice versa, that the consumer one's like, why are you doing this ABM marketing campaign in the B2B world? Like, that sounds like a waste of resources. But then maybe the consumer marketer, the provider marketer says, wait a minute, maybe we should be doing more
Yes.
ABM focused,
Yes.
right? So by having them all together, it'll stretch what we think of marketing, and we can, maybe embrace some of the ideas of, all the different areas of healthcare marketing.
Yeah, and I think what you're both talking about and really leaning into as well, the differences, but also the same challenges that everybody's facing in marketing. It sort of speaks to it's a digital world and the online experience and SEO and AI, of course, which was a huge topic across all tracks at the Sway event in May, this past May. And so that's interesting that there are these common threads that impact all marketers, whether you're B2B or B2C, whether you're in the healthcare vertical or transportation or whatever. But then there are differences that we can even learn from. We're not all so different, but good marketing is good marketing. Good marketing strategies are good marketing strategies, and take what we can from it. Right? It's a tri-hosted podcast. So I would love to know, really, what sort of flair and bent each one of you will take to the episodes that you're going to be hosting.
Well, I think I bring the sass, so there's that.
I am not going to argue with that.
And the rest of us are just trying to be as good as Brittany. That's the desire.
I'm sorry, if you have sassy hair, you have to live up to the sass. That's just all
Right?
I'm saying.
Have to. We all bring a different, perspective. We all have different backgrounds. What my previous work experience gives me different experiences, John's and Colin's. So I think it's nice that we all have different experience and different voices and different opinions. So we can kind of come together. We may not always agree, which we don't, but I think that, makes for a good podcast and good conversation. So
Yeah.
I think we all bring something different to the party.
So podcast is launching. Tell us a little bit about the frequency. How often do you expect a new podcast episode to release? And how long will they be? Are they going to be as long as a cat's tail, or which I had to explain that to somebody the other day. They didn't know what that meant. But or do you have a certain time frame in mind and a certain format in mind for that?
That's another great question. I think we don't have a set length. So I think the interviews, the stories that we do, they will vary between 15 minutes up to maybe 40 minutes. I think it really is up to the guest and the context, right? If we're doing like a panel discussion, it might go a little longer. If we're having a super interesting discussion on a really relevant topic, it might go longer. And some of them might be a little bit shorter if we're kind of doing an interview on the spot at our conferences, at a conference or something. So I don't think there's going to be a set, like, oh, it's always going to be a half-hour episode. It's always going to be an hour episode. It's not going to be that formulaic. Our goal at the beginning is to release at least one episode a week. But as you know, during the more busy times where we're at conferences, there might actually be more.
Right.
So So the idea is not to take every interview that we do on video and just translate it into the podcast. That's not our formula, but we may take snippets from those and turn them into a nice consolidated podcast. So that's kind of the plan in terms of frequency. So at least one a week
Wow.
at the start, and then kind of go from there.
And I'd say we've learned, I bet you've seen the same, Carol, with all your podcasts, is that most people that are listening to podcasts, we're not Taylor Swift where they're waiting for the next release of the next album or the next podcast, right?
You will be if you will be if you get that
Waiting
guest
for
lineup.
the Tuesday night release at 10 p.m. in order to hear the next episode from Colin, right? Instead, I think most people with podcasts, especially B2B podcasts like this, is they collect a whole bunch of them and then they go through the list, right? And they start listening when they have time on a holiday or on a weekend or as they're driving. And so they kind of go through and maybe they skip a few, right? If they're a provider organization and we start talking about hymns, they probably skip that episode and move to the next one, versus listening to it, and vice versa, right? The B2B probably skips some of the provider ones that talk about patient acquisition and driving service lines. So, I think, at this, what we've found is we probably are going to produce enough podcasts that everyone's going to have a pile of the Swaay.Health podcast sitting there waiting for them to listen to, and so they'll be able to scroll through it. So, yeah, that's the goal, is to have enough content that whenever they want to hear their healthcare marketing content, they can turn to the Swaay.Health podcast.
Maybe
Sorry,
one
I
day we'll get
sorry.
to that T-Swift,
T-Swift.
point where people are waiting for it to drop.
I was actually a guest on a recent podcast, and the host asked me if I could have anybody on my show as a guest, who would it be? Dead or she didn't say dead or alive, but I actually chose a fictional character, to be honest with you. I said Gandalf. I want Gandalf on my show. I want to hear what he has to say. So it could be dead or alive or fictional. You could go my way. She was like, Gandalf, and I'm like, you're not a Lord of the Rings. I couldn't quite figure out if she was Lord of the Rings or not, but she was surprised. She's like, not Abe Lincoln? You want Gandalf? I said, well, who doesn't? Duh.
That's funny.
Gandalf would be fun, actually. He would have some stories to tell. Like there's all that stories of all that time
3,000 years worth of stories. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So dead, alive, or fictional.
Yeah.
How has marketing changed in the last 3,000 years? Gandalf, please help.
Gandalf, who's your PR person? Because you need a new one.
Get some new clothes, for goodness sake. You can't afford a new hat. You gotta wear the same old robes with holes.
It's his signature uniform.
That's true.
Works for him.
You guys are skirting the question. I'm sorry, I got us on the Gandalf Lord of the Rings track. That happens in my household. So.
I think you inspired a new series. We're going to do an interview, and Colin's going to be Gandalf and answer as Gandalf.
I have to buy a wizard hat for sure.
Oh, that's funny.
I'll go first. I think if I think of it, I think of the podcast that we're launching and how I can do better and be better and ask the questions that need to be asked. So I feel like I would say Howard Stern. But I know he's a bit controversial, and some people love him, some people hate him. But I feel like he could teach me a few things, and if nothing else, it would be a really good conversation. And he always asks those hard-hitting questions, so I think he would teach me the ropes of his craft.
He's pretty fearless.
Right?
We're just going to argue about that for sure.
I need a little bit more of that in my life, so maybe he could teach me a few things.
And your hair is almost exactly the same.
Oh, there you go. We're twins, basically, so why not?
You could bond for 15 minutes over that. Like, what hair
exactly
do you use for your curls? And
totally.
Past person, definitely hands down Albert Einstein. Ooh. I would love to have spoken to him. I mean, he is, not only brilliant, but he was also quite eccentric, and I'm sure he had ideas on almost everything. And he seemed like the person who would also ask questions and was just naturally curious. So I would love to have sit down and have a conversation with Albert Einstein. I'm sure probably half the stuff he said would go over my head, but it would be just wonderful to have a conversation with him. But currently, like alive, I would have to say for me, it's James Cameron. because
Oh, no
to
kidding.
me, he is the blend of right and left side brain, right? Like on one hand, he's made so many inventions. He went down to the Titanic, and yet he's created some of the biggest films of all time, right? Like
Yeah.
Avatar and Titanic and Terminator 2 and just Aliens. Like to me, he's like the epitome of like creative and genius. And I would love to do an interview with James Cameron, and it has nothing to do with the fact that he's Canadian. But you know, just
It
we
has
just would love
everything
to
to do with
sit
the
down.
fact that he's a Canadian, but
Yeah.
That's interesting. I would say, if I'm talking current ones, Mark Cuban probably tops my list, which interestingly is
Oh,
actually like semi-doable. We could even have him on.
he
But
might
I
actually come
find him
on. Yeah.
fascinating across business, across marketing, even healthcare now, and his takes on, what's happening in pharmaceuticals and how he's trying to F up the business as he says it. So I think he's a fascinating interview. I love his approach, and he's pretty, straightforward and to the point. So I think he'd be fascinating. If I go old school, there's a bunch of religious ones I could list, but I'll set those aside for a minute. But here's a little off the charts one. I'd like to interview Brute, like A2 Brute and Caesar, right? Like, hey, what really went down there? Like,
Did
if
you
we
really
want a
put
little
them in the
story
back?
about that.
Like,
Yeah, like, yeah, I mean, sure, Caesar's interesting too, but like, hey, Brutus, what were you thinking, man? This doesn't sound right. I want to get
oh,
I want to create the crime drama for all the people who love the crime dramas about Brutus and
yeah,
get the background story there. That would be a little, off the board one for me. That would be fascinating, I
yeah.
think.
So right now the audience is thinking, okay, I'm going to tune in because these three people are going to interview Howard Stern, Albert Einstein, James Cameron, Mark Cuban, Brutus, and of course Gandalf. So like, hey, I'm tuning in
It's
like
an epic
tomorrow.
lineup.
Epic,
Oh.
beyond epic. Last question for you guys. What is the one thing, in your opinion, that separates a mediocre, good podcast from a really good, great podcast? The one thing. There's lots of things, but what's the one thing?
I'll chime in first. I was watching a PR person reading something they wrote, and they said, as a PR person, our goal should be to be novel. And I thought about it. I was like, yeah, I've always tried to describe this and I couldn't come up with the right word, which was tell me something I don't know. That's what I usually say. And I'm like, that's a hard, bar to overcome because you don't know what I know. You don't know what, I was like, but bring me something novel. That makes sense, right? Like, how can you bring something novel? And that's, I think, our goal with the Swaay.Health podcast is let's offer some novel things. Now, the challenge for us is that we have some listeners that are brand new to healthcare marketing or brand new to marketing and PR in
Sure.
general. And then we have some that are, executives that have 20 years of experience. And so, we definitely have to, figure out that balance. It's been the challenge with the Swaay.Health conference as well is how do you provide high level advanced content or even executive type of content versus more practical insights, and so I think we're going to have some of both. And so, people, listeners to the Swaay.Health podcast are going to probably hear some episodes and say, oh, that wasn't what I was looking for. They want to go to the
Right.
next one, but maybe their teammate needs to hear it and they need to send it to
Right.
them. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. And so, I mean, if you look at something just as simple as SEO, search engine optimization from a practical perspective would be a very different episode than how should a CMO at a healthcare organization be approaching SEO. Those would be two separate episodes. And I think, for us, I think that's our goal is to provide content for both of those audience and help them understand, hey, this is available for you, but also for your team. So you may want to spread it around.
So the one thing I think that makes for a good podcast is I think it has to be the topic, the interviewee or the host have to be the thing that people relate to.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, either if you can have one of those three things happen, then I think people can get engaged. And I think that for me is what separates a good podcast from one that I may not listen to. So I would want to say, hey, that topic is really relevant to what I'm doing right now, or it's really important to me. And so I'll tune in. It almost doesn't matter who's interviewing who, right?
Right.
Other times the topic isn't as exciting, but I really identify with either the host or the interviewee. because I'm either like, I don't know anything about this topic. And so I identify with the host, and I'm hoping that he or she will ask the questions that I would have asked had I been in the room. Or on the other time, it's more like identify with, boy, I really want to hear the story of this person that they're interviewing. So,
Right.
so for me, I think making sure that one of those three things is relatable to members of your audience, to me, is what separates a good podcast from an okay podcast.
Brittany, I think we're closing it out with you.
But yeah,
I think, my kind of goes along with similar to what John and Colin say, but mine is authenticity. I think that if you're authentic in the stories that you're telling and the experiences that you're sharing, and you're sharing, genuine experiences and insights, it creates a really good connection with the audience and people who are listening to, and, makes for really memorable content. So I think the authenticity fosters that trust and will keep people kind of coming back. I don't listen to podcasts that, I can tell don't really have that kind of authentic realm to it. So I think that's what I'd like to bring, to this podcast. And I think what we will bring is to make sure that it's authentic and people, can really garner that out of what we're saying.
Yeah. Well, John, Colin, Brittany, it was great chatting with you. Thank you so much for inviting me on to talk about the Swaay.Health podcast. I will be one of your biggest fans, I promise. And we'll have to come back and I'll chat again, like in 6 months on my show or something, see how it's going. I'd love that.
absolutely. We'll have to have you come back on the year anniversary of the launch, and we can see how it's
Oh,
gone.
okay. I'm going to put that on my calendar right now.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Carol.
First, on behalf of Brittany, John, and myself, I want to thank you for being here with us on this very first episode of Swaay.Health's podcast. We can't wait to bring you the next one and to continue generating this wonderful content. But it would really be helpful to us if you could like and subscribe this podcast wherever you're listening or watching it. I also want to thank Carol Flagg for graciously agreeing to be our host today. It was a lot of fun to have her ask the questions. And if you have any suggestions for future podcast episodes or would like to be a guest, head on over to Swaay.Health, click on the navigation bar where you'll see the podcast setting, and then there you can drop us a line. And by the way, that's Swaay.Health, that's Swaay with 2 A's, .health. I'm Colin Hung. Thanks for being here, and I'll catch you on a future episode.